That Triathlon Show 321. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Associate Professor Max Paquette of the University of Memphis. We start by discussing running training load and going beyond just mileage as a measure of load, and that's something that Max and co-authors have written an article about that I'll link to in the show notes as well. But we also discuss other topics related to, for example, running biomechanics and injury risk, ground surfaces, and so on. So there's plenty of interesting topics that we go into. But before that, big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Precision Fuel and Hydration that have a range of tools and products to help you personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so that you can perform at your best. Previously known as Precision Hydration, they have changed their name to reflect the fact that they're working both in hydration and in nutrition with tools and products in both categories. Everyone sweats differently with regard to sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration and need individualized hydration strategies and also fueling strategies because they will depend on factors like the duration and intensity of your activity. To figure out the best approach for you, head to precisionfuelandhydration.com and use their free online sweat test and their quick carb calculator to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs during training and racing. Then you can book a free one-to-one video consultation with the team to refine your hydration and nutrition strategy. As a listener of the show, you can get 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products by using the code TTS22 at checkout at precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Zenite. The Zenite indoor swim trainer is a one-of-a-kind swim bench that helps you improve your technique through an early catch, maximize your propulsion through a more powerful stroke, and stay consistent by doing swim workouts at home even when you can't go to the pool. It is now available in the UK, EU, and the US with free shipping in both the UK and the US. It is very affordable, similar to a pair of running shoes, and best of all, the investment is risk-free, because if you're not in love with the Zenite trainer after 2 weeks of using it and using their free training program, then you can send it back and get a full refund. Learn more and get a 20% discount on your swim trainer on zeniteswimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Max Paquette. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Max. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me, Michael.
It's a great pleasure. You have done some tremendous research in the field of running, in particular running biomechanics. So we'll get into several of the studies that you've conducted and so on. But before we do that, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, Max Paquette. I'm an associate professor in the United States, at the University of Memphis. I'm originally from Canada, small town in Eastern Ontario. I kind of got into running later in high school and sort of fell in love with running. And then through university with the science degree that I was pursuing, I kind of knew I was going to merge both sort of passions, if you will, running and science. And then did a doctoral degree and then into a faculty position in Memphis. And I've been doing running science research since. And so it's worked out pretty well. And really love to kind of talk about it and share some of the findings that we've observed over the years.
Yeah. And are you still running yourself?
Yeah, I'm on the my training program is probably not optimal or ideal, probably risky. In fact, I'm probably on a run when you feel like it program. And then sometimes I get coerced into doing crazy things, like I'm pacing a marathon this weekend. So we'll see how that goes. But I stick with it. I run enough that I can maintain some level of fitness that I can sort of, build from there when I want to. But it's not the best approach. It's not something I would recommend.
Right. Well, let's first get into the topic of training load. And for the listeners, I will link in the show notes to a study called Moving Beyond Weekly Distance, Optimizing Quantification of Training Load in Runners. So can you first just give a broad overview of what led you to to conduct this or to write this this review?
It's this. So it's a commentary in a way, or a narrative review, if you will. Myself and Trent Stellingworth, who's Canadian, and Chris Napier, who's Canadian, and Rich Willey, who's a physio in here in the U.S. in Montana. We had been talking about sharing our thoughts and some of the evidence currently available on quantifying training in runners, simply because forever, as you know, and as your listeners know, running training is typically quantified using mileage or kilometers, distance in a way. So, we thought it would be worth spending some time writing a paper to discuss other options and why other options might be better. The goal was really education and not necessarily telling people what to do, but giving people an idea or ideas of other ways to think about training monitoring. Not necessarily saying this is the only way to do it, but here are other options that it might be worth. And of course, the title implies moving beyond weekly mileage or distance, that we just wanted people to think a bit differently about it. And so not be stuck in the way of just measuring distance, but also thinking about other factors that are involved. And this is particularly important to triathletes, of course, given the three disciplines.
Yeah. So here's a two-part question then. First, what are the potential issues with monitoring training load based on distance alone or mileage alone? And secondly, what are some of the other alternatives that you discuss and propose?
Well, it's like anything we measure, right? Like there sometimes we want to keep it simple. And so, not before I talk about the issues, the reason why people do it is mostly because it's simple, right? We can measure, we take a GPS watch and you just, you figure out there's mile 1, mile 2, mile 3, so on and so forth. The primary issue with using that approach is that if a coach is training a number of athletes of different levels and not necessarily different categories of caliber of runner, for example, but even within a national level or regional level or international level, there will be some sort of differences or some differences in terms of, paces and abilities and, daily exertion levels for different athletes. And so by assuming that if 10 athletes run 10 miles together, that the stimulus on those 10 miles is the same is a bit of a mistake, in our opinion, in that, of course, some people 10 miles might be, they might complete 10 miles at some slower pace. And so if you run a 10-mile run at 8 minute per mile pace, while you're spending more time on running and, taking steps essentially than someone who's running 10 miles at 7 minute per mile pace. Of course, the pace is different, but it's always relative. So that's, I would say, the primary, issue with distance and, even to some extent duration, is that you're not really accounting for individual responses to the training. And that's when the measurement of effort and sort of physiological load comes into play. So, RPE, rate of perceived exertion, or heart rate, or, other measures that people might be able to take into account. Better alternatives, I suppose I just touched on that a little bit, but, ultimately, I will say this is not the answer that people want because it's not clear cut, but I would say that there's no magic bullet or there's no magic recipe to say, use this method and it will be foolproof, right? That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in anything. So what we're trying to achieve is give people a different way of thinking about training so that they can implement ways to monitor their athletes outside of what's been done, right? Just to consider different factors. And if we can achieve that, I think, it'll help quite a bit with, helping coaches and athletes, improve and get better.
So what is the different way of thinking that you're alluding to there?
Right. So again, like if anytime in any profession or discipline or job or sport, if all you think about is one variable or one factor, obviously the human body is a complex system, and so if you think about one variable all the time, you're going to miss a lot of other things that are contributing to the outcome of the training, right? So this is an example of you make 20 athletes complete, X amount of miles per week for X amount of weeks. Over time, some will do well, some will do not so well. Some of them will regress, some of them will improve, some of them will get injured, some of them will stay healthy. And a coach might wonder, well, how come this person got injured or this person did well? I don't know. I don't understand. They all did the same thing. Well, that's exactly the issue, right? They all did the same thing, and it was measured the same way. So considering factors outside of just running, for example, like in triathlon, it's probably more easier to grasp, because if I'm monitoring running training in a triathlete, I have to consider cycling training and swimming training. And of course, all these will affect the outcome of the running training. In student athletes, high school or collegiate athletes, or, you're going to see some issues where there's academic stress that plays into, there's relationship stress. There's, for professional athletes, maybe financial stress or relationship stress, all these different things that, of course, you can't measure with one variable. So thinking outside the box and, being quite open, not necessarily open, but communicative with athletes and understanding what's going on. I read a tweet from a sort of legendary coach, Vern Gambetta, the other day, and he said basically, along the lines of, elite sports is all about pushing boundaries, and so, the best way to sort of, manage athletes is to manage risks, right? We're not predicting anything, we're not preventing anything, but we can manage risks. And so by thinking outside of just distance, you can understand other factors that might be involved in performance improvements or injury risks, and we can somewhat manage those. We can't predict if it's going to get hurt or improve or get worse, but we can at least manage, those risks. It's a bit like gambling, but gambling very safely in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the whole point is to take into account a multitude of factors. Like you can look at distance for one, but you can look at RPE and how it changes week to week in different types of workouts. You can look at heart rate. You can look at look at the maybe even things like heart rate variability or things in the morning, and basically taking a broader view of it than just looking at one variable. That's the gist
right,
of it.
And exactly. And those the factors you just mentioned are all things that are nowadays easily measured, but not for everyone, right? Some people don't have access or even know what those things are. So you mentioned heart rate variability, heart rate, RPE, but there's also simple things like noticing an athlete's demeanor, right? Their expression, how they move, right? Most coaches that are in tune with their athletes know what an athlete looks like when they're feeling good and know what they look like when they don't feel good. And so you don't need to probe, with too many questions and try to get into their personal lives, but you get a good gauge on, something's not right today. We can adjust certain things and we can manipulate certain factors in training and increase recovery time. So it's not just about technology. I want to point that out. It's not just about technology and numbers, but it's also about paying attention and communicating and observing what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. I saw a tweet today. I actually retweeted that, and which was a graphic kind of talking about the point that data is not just numbers. Data is the behavior that an athlete is expressing, what they're saying, what they're writing in comments, and so on. Like all of that is data, right. And that is a common misconception that you have to have, as you said, one simple number or one single number. And I want to come back to one thing you said about triathlon and how it's so important for triathletes to manage this with 3 different sports. We have tried to do this with training stress score, and I mean some companies and people in particular are pushing the training stress score thing very a lot, that you can kind of look at your swimming and cycling and running combined. And I've for quite a long time been quite neutrally opposed to it almost, because I think it's just so so difficult, and you can't really compare between the different disciplines because there are different factors. It's not just if we're talking about just the metabolic load, then maybe it's more relevant, but even how you measure it with power when it comes to cycling, pace when it comes to running, pace when it comes to swimming, with or without equipment, it all becomes almost invalid with all of those confounding factors and different measurement techniques. So you can't really make a composite metric in that way with just training stress score. And I think it speaks to what your original point, that we're trying to make things simple that aren't necessarily simple.
This is a great example, Michael, in that, people are searching for the one score, the one number, the one value, the one threshold that will tell them what to do, right? But as you just alluded to with cycling, wattage or power meters and swimming, and swimming's so different than running, and running is different than cycling. But I think ultimately a good coach will have a way to juggle all of the three disciplines and be able to understand that there was a hard swimming session the morning, and then there was a hard running session in the afternoon, and they're able to sort of piece it together without necessarily seeing specific numbers. And as long as a coach or an athlete has some method to quantify their training that is consistent over time, and more importantly, potentially reliable, so they can do this, they can rate it or gauge it reliably. That's really what we're after, right? It's sort of day-to-day changes and week-to-week changes and month-to-month, not necessarily for an individual athlete. You don't care about comparing to your teammate or your training partner. It's more so about yourself. And so, you're right in that it's difficult to do it all in one, but good athletes and coaches have ways to monitor their training and their responses to it, in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And one example of that would be actually an experiment that I'm just starting with myself as an athlete, and I haven't rolled it out to my athletes yet because I'm not sure it will work. But there is an app where you can measure quite accurately, or hopefully very accurately, a counter movement jump or even a reactive strength index test, and just measuring that on a weekly basis to monitor the neuromuscular status of the body is something that I'm attempting to do. And when you combine that with measuring, for example, heart rate variability for the autonomic system status, and then just general RPE and things like that, then looking at all of that forms a kind of a complete holistic picture when you have all of those different things. But then you still have to take a decision, as you say, risk management, and there's no formula for inputting all of that.
Exactly. There's two things. One, yes, there are a lot of tests and measurements we can conduct or take to monitor, whether it's fatigue or training response or what have you. It's really easy to get caught up in the weeds and measuring a bunch of things and trying to combine them and understand what they mean. I really recommend people that and this is probably the hardest thing, honestly, beyond tech, is coaches and athletes need to really dedicate some time to focus on, especially for athletes, or coaches to explain this to athletes, and athletes making a conscious effort to learn this, is how they feel, how, like, knowing their body and the response and the signs that come with it. It's very difficult for tech to measure all these signs. Some people might be, when I'm really tired, coffee doesn't keep me awake, for example. Or when I'm really tired, I drop things when I walk around, or, I trip on stuff, or, just there's a couple of, there's a number of factors that can pop up with fatigue and overtraining, for example. And so I think education is the key there. Is really trying for athletes and coaches to understand the athlete and themselves, and come up with their own solutions. Data is useful and tech's useful, but also you've got to listen and understand your body as much as possible. And then, so that's, the main thing is there's a lot of technology that's available and we can measure all things. And the last thing you mentioned is sometimes we don't quite know how to manage risk. And that's the age old question about technology, is the implementation of the results, right? How do we affect change? You get X numbers on a test or a measurement. What's the next move? Do you just take a day off? Do you back off the training session? Do you make it harder? Right? We don't have these answers quite yet, especially from an injury risk reduction standpoint. From a performance standpoint, I think we're a little further ahead, but from an injury risk standpoint, we don't really know. And so that's the big question mark, is what do we do with these data in terms of decision making in the short or long term?
Yeah. Well, it comes down to, in the end, still to intuition almost, or intuition combined with all of the data. Intuition based on all of the data you can collect in conjunction with each other, including, for example, subjective feedback, as you mentioned. And I do think as a coach that the subjective feedback from an athlete that is in tune with their body, that is the most important piece of data that you can get.
Yeah, you're right. It goes back to risk management. That's what it comes down to. You might not be certain, but if you have doubts, and it's hard, especially at the elite level, or even at the sub-elite level and national, regional level. Athletes want to get better. They want to improve their personal bests. They want to be faster. They want to finish higher in the placings. And so, saying, "Oh, you're really tired," we'll just back off the session. Sometimes that's good, but also sometimes, it's a fine line between backing off too much and pushing through too much, right? So again, risk management is, I think, the key term, and for performance or overtraining or injury risks. Personally, I'll give you my personal opinion on that. Is I think I always like to err on the side of caution. I right now I mostly coach junior athletes, so high school level, so grade 9 to like 14 to 18-year-old runners. And so for me, it's a no-brainer in that case. Like, it's always, when in doubt, just pull back, do less. Now at the professional or higher level, sometimes, you do take that risk. You do push it, even if it's, maybe there's some things that are telling you, that's not quite, maybe we should be careful. It's like, well, one more week or something, you're always pushing boundaries. So it just depends on the athlete you're coaching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing regarding injury risk, one thing that you have worked on a lot, and there have been tweets and presentations floating around as well, is around the neuromuscular load of running and some calculations around that. I think Trent Stellingwerth had a presentation, or maybe it was your presentation. I can't even remember, but some calculations around that. But in sort of simple terms, can you explain a little bit around the neuromuscular load of running and the moderating factors that impact neuromuscular load?
Yeah, that's certainly a term that Trent has used quite a bit in the past, and we use it as an example in the commentary. One way that you can kind of summarize it is, there's not really. It's a bit of a broad term to encompass a number of things, right? So a simple way, to me, it falls into sort of mechanical loading on the body in a way, because any mechanical force, any mechanical stress that's applied to the body is going to be sort of the response will be some kind of neuromuscular, input from the body. And so, we talk about contact time, for example, and number of steps and versus, so number of steps, contact time, and so time under tension. Then you can kind of measure, if you take 1,000 steps and each step takes 150 milliseconds, you can figure out, that you're taking X amount of, or you're spending X amount of, seconds under tension. And so that's one way to think of it, is, demands on the body, essentially, in a broad term, right?
Yeah.
And as opposed to mileage, where people use mileage as, demand on the body. Again, if you think of it this way, like, if you and I go for a run and I spend 230 milliseconds on the ground and you spend 200 milliseconds on the ground every step you take, if we both take 1,000 steps, obviously I'm going to spend more time under tension. I'm going to spend more time, where I have to produce muscular output, or there's mechanical stresses being applied to my body, and so on and so forth. So that's the concept anyway. It's just to compare between athletes, and even within athletes, if we're fatigued, we may spend more time on the ground, for example, because, we're not as bouncy, or our lower limbs aren't as stiff and being able to sort of rebound quickly. So these factors would kind of all fall under neuromuscular load, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. And so you explained how you get to the kind of time under tension metric, and then from there, one thing that can be important to think about as well is how every time you hit the ground, you experience a force that is basically a multiple of your body weight.
Yeah.
So you can calculate the total force or total load in that way as well. And that was something when I saw that first, which was now probably at the beginning of this year, is when I started thinking about this a little bit more. But just thinking about how body weight, without placing any judgment, of course, on it, but how it impacts the sustainable mileage, and why it makes sense that a 60 kilogram Kenyan runner can run a lot. Of course, there's a lot more to it. They have grown up running and built up to it over years. But why it, like, even if it was metabolically possible for a triathlete to run like a runner, the build of triathletes is also often quite difficult, a bit more muscular, a bit quite often bigger in general, meaning carrying more weight, and then the load in terms of a Newton or kilogram perspective being that much higher, so it can come with an increased injury risk there as well from that perspective. So I think that as coaches, that's an interesting perspective to look at when looking at when looking at how to keep athletes injury free. Actually, body weight is one variable that can be quite important there, because a multiple of body weight is exerted on the body in every single step.
Yeah, I'd be careful with that, of course, because it's not, we're often reporting this as relative to body weight, not in absolute, force units like newtons, for example. It's relative to your body. So if I run with 3 times my body weight, and you run with 3 times your body weight, and we weigh different, or we have different masses, that body weight is different for both of us, but it's relative to us, right? And so, I would just be careful about mass and injuries, because as you alluded to briefly, if training is done well and progressed over time, you adapt. Basically, the musculotendinous tissues adapt, and skeletal tissue adapts to that load that you're dealing with every step. Which is one of the reasons why we take time building up. The other thing I would mention too is, the composition of that mass is quite important. An elite triathlete, who is obviously has a high percent of lean mass or muscle mass, is carrying very functional weight. So the weight is quite useful, especially, if they're a better cyclist than other disciplines. They're going to have fairly muscular legs, obviously, for cycling. And so, one thing we don't know is how much, more muscle mass might be protective against, musculoskeletal injuries. Because yes, there's more mass, but also there's some of that mass is actually doing work to help sort of absorb energy and generate energy. So, we have to be careful around mass, as you mentioned as well. But I would say that, generally speaking, mass is rarely a factor in terms of injuries across the board, right? Across all populations of runners. That might be the case in beginner runners, where people are actually starting out running to lose weight, for example. That's a whole different story, though.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in terms of performance, that's a different story completely. But we just have to be careful with body mass and injuries, and how it's perceived, and how we talk about it.
Very interesting. Thank you for correcting me on that. Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, for sure.
Wasn't aware of the fact that it's actually not really predictive of injury, but that's super valuable to know. A couple of other factors then in terms of the neuromuscular load. What about terrain and footwear? Do these factors have an impact?
Yeah. I mean, I say yeah, in a non-scientific way here, mostly because the evidence, scientifically, evidence on this is not strong either way. In terms of footwear and injury risks, that's a whole episode, obviously. But obviously a hot debate. But again, there's really no strong evidence that if a specific footwear type is prescribed to a specific runner, it'll improve or reduce risks of injuries. And so that's something that is a bit of a gray area in our field. There's concepts around comfort, basically, wear comfortable shoes and you'll reduce injury risks. But that bubble has bursted a bit because people buy comfortable shoes all the time and they still get injured. And then the whole, pronation control, control pronation with motion control shoes. And, that doesn't work either. That's been shown as well. So the only thing with regards to injuries and footwear that seems to be fairly well accepted, and I'm not going to say accepted across the board, but probably the most well accepted idea with footwear is basically having or using a number of different types of footwear in training. So having a high rotation of shoes. So you may alternate between a pair of shoe on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, another pair of shoe on Tuesday and Thursday, and a different one on Saturday and Sunday, kind of thing. That's a fairly well accepted idea. The evidence is not strong either, but it's there at least. Whereas other concepts it's just not there.
Is there no evidence for cushioning, the amount of cushioning in the shoe?
No, I mean not in terms of like prospective, studies where if you randomize a number of people in high cushion or no cushion or barefoot or other types of shoe and you see what happens, like there's no strong evidence that any of those types of shoes will lead to lower risks or lower rates of injuries. It's not a fun finding because it's confusing, but I will say though, based on research and clinical practice, some colleagues and practitioners, acutely in the short term, when a runner is dealing with an injury or rehabbing from an injury, there may be some strategies acutely that we can use to basically, I can't say acutely enough, but in the short term, shift loads a little bit away from maybe a damaged tissue or symptomatic tissue to help with the rehabilitation process. So again, I'm not saying that if you're injured, wear this type of shoe. Depending on the injury, you might be able to try to shift loads a bit away from that injured area to manage the symptoms while you're rehabbing. But aside from that, the footwear and running injury literature is fairly weak at the moment. With regards to terrain, or go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask about the terrain aspect.
Yeah, with regards to terrain, so recently I spoke with Brad Beer on the Physical Performance Show out of Australia, just on that, on surface interactions and with runners. So that might be a good listen. It's about an hour or so on just focusing on surfaces. But the summary here is that I'll make 2 points. So I would start by saying, just like in footwear, there's probably some value in altering, surfaces that people run on, mostly to change up the mechanical stimulus on various tissues, not just muscle, tendons, but bones and just overall shifting mechanical stresses around. And I'll mention one fairly big misconception around running surfaces. A lot of people, and I've heard this since I started running, in the late 90s, and people have always said that running on softer surfaces is a better surface in terms of injury risk, right? There's not really no evidence on this, but what we know is that when you run on a softer surface, of course, what it does is it changes how you run. Specifically, your lower limb stiffens, meaning that think of it as your lower limb as a spring. When you transition from a hard to a softer, a compliant surface, a surface that sort of compresses quite easily, like sand or grass or soft dirt. What ends up happening is that your lower limb spring becomes very stiff. So when that happens, of course, place a little more, mechanical stress on your Achilles tendon, potentially, up the chain to the patellar tendon, and of course, muscles are not moving as much, so the strain is less. But everything becomes stiffer, right? And whereas when you run on a hard surface, that's not the case. I mean, you still have some stiffness, but your body is more compliant, right? So the point of this is if you maintain a running speed and you run on pavement and then you transition to running on grass at the same speed, one thing that happens with soft surfaces is that the ground is not as responsive, right? The ground doesn't push back on you as much. So to maintain the same speed as you ran on a hard surface, you have to basically generate more muscular work. And of course, when you do that, it increases, the stresses on your musculotendinous tissues. So those that have Achilles injuries, even muscular strains, running on soft surfaces, especially if you try to maintain your running speed, might be detrimental. Now, if you slow down, that might not be as big a deal. But if you maintain your running speed, the demands of the musculotendinous tissue are higher. And so that might sort of exacerbate the problems there. For bone injuries, it might be useful to go on soft surfaces, again, if you slow down, because now the forces applied to your body are less, which is good for bone. But at the same time, if you go fast, we know that when muscles pull on bones, they compress bones, and those compressive forces contribute to the forces and the damage on the bone. So it's a bit of you got to be careful. So my recommendation is, yes, you can run on soft surfaces, but use it to slow yourself down. And I tell some athletes that I coach often, I often run on trails on easy days to force myself to go easy, even if I feel good, because it's harder to run fast on a soft surface on a trail. I'm not talking about a technical, trail with roots and hills. I'm talking about, a soft gravel or dirt or grass trail where you have to slow down, and it forces yourself to slow down. If you maintain your pace on a soft surface, it might actually be detrimental to musculotendinous tissue. Yeah, that's, I think, an important take home with terrain.
Yeah, I listened to that episode with Brad, and definitely I'll link to that in the show notes as well. It's worth listening to for listeners that are interested in going deeper. I think one thing you mentioned there as well was around the concept of soft surfaces and trails. Actually, a lot of trails are quite hard packed dirt, so they're not actually that soft. So it's almost only in our head that they are soft because it's not asphalt, it's not road.
Which is very true, but they're also unpredictable. And so I'm not sure that the whole idea of like stiffening the lower limb on soft surfaces is only because of soft surfaces. It's also because when you stiffen the lower limb, you limit the possibility for joint motions. And so this happens if you run at night on a hard surface, you can't see the ground very well, you will also stiffen your lower limb. And so on trails, when you can't predict, when sometimes you can't really tell, if there's leaves on the ground or if there's, the depth perception might be off a little bit. You might not be able to predict where your foot's going to land. So you'll stiffen though, anyway, innately, even if the ground is packed, right? And I think also just the action of like turning and maybe jumping over a root or, the uneven ground of trail running contributes to this concept as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you gave some great practical ideas there for how to incorporate it, and I think that take-home message is great, and also just to remember that, or like just as to add to that, there's no substitute for just generally building up your load in a good, conservative or appropriate manner. Like you can't shortcut that by just starting to run on trails a bunch. Like you still run some risks, even if they might be slightly different than if you run on hard surfaces.
Right.
And then what about intensity? So if you run fast versus running slow, we talked about that now in the context of terrain, but in general terms, if we stick to the road, for example, how does that impact things like injury risk, load on the tendons, on the muscles, on the bones, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, pace and speed are obviously relative to the person. So, fast for one person might be very slow for another person. So, I think it's important that it's all relative to the person. And so, if you have a person who runs, 12 minute per mile, that's their typical pace, which is for most, that's their running pace, and so that's obviously going to lead to very different mechanical stresses applied to the body than someone who's running 5:30 minute per mile pace. And that's just the reality of physics, right? I mean, so even though it is relative, like it also matters how fast you're going in absolute terms. But there's some interesting research that shows, obviously, generally speaking, on average, speed at faster speeds, you can sort of increase mechanical load on the body. So specifically, the vertical forces go up. So peak vertical force, its loading rate, or how quickly the force is loaded on the body, and then demands sort of plantar, like calf demands on your calves sort of go up within not sprinting speeds, but within normal running speeds, and so on and so forth. So of course, forces and mechanical stresses go up as you increase speed. That being said, it's very individual. So I've done some testing in elite distance runners, and some runners at faster speeds, the forces actually go down, at what we might call like an optimal, pace for mechanical stress. And then it goes back up as they speed up. And then some runners, a small increase in speed, really increases the forces applied to the body. And while others, increasing speed, is a shallow increase in force. And then finally others, you increase speed and nothing changes. They're pretty flat, right? And so this comes in the reason for this is some runners, as speed goes up, they adjust how they run. So, for example, if you watch Kipchoge jog, and I'll say jog because, for him it's slow running, but the way that he runs is very different than when he's running, 4:33 per mile at his marathon pace. They're very, very different. You wouldn't even recognize the guy, right? And so same thing with everyone. So if you're running at a slower pace, you're likely running differently than if you're running at a faster pace. And that I think is just innately how we adjust to running speed and the task that we're accomplishing to minimize the cost of locomotion, of moving. And so speed is a tough one, which is why I think sometimes it is valuable to do some mechanical testing or biomechanical testing at different speeds for different runners to understand what different paces mean for them mechanically. Now, physiologically, it's easier because you can measure heart rate or RPE or things like that. But mechanically, it's important to understand how going fast influences a runner, whereas another runner might not respond the same way. And that allows a coach to understand even better the training load for that specific runner, if they prescribe faster or faster workouts more often than not, kind of thing. So I would encourage people to come up with a way to assess how every athlete responds to changes in speed. I think there's quite a bit of value there.
Are there any things we can say generally, for example, regarding elite runners, for example, would they benefit from running their easy runs at a slower relative intensity than slower runners to maybe limit the absolute loading from those easy runs without necessarily giving up the metabolic adaptations that they will get from that? Can we say anything about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, running easy is always good. Running is easy when you're supposed to, and in recovery mode. Now, the easy is relative, of course. Like, I try to get across to various runners that, most runners, even at the elite level, so elite men and women, probably run their easy runs somewhere in the 6:20 to 7:45 per mile pace, depending on average, right? Like they might run slower at times or faster at times, but on average, I would say in 6:20 to 8-minute pace is probably realistic for most elite.
That's about 4:15 to 5 per kilometer, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right. I mean, you could do this very quickly. Hop on Strava and take a look at some of the best runners in the United States or around the world, and you'll notice like some of the easy run paces are a lot slower than you might imagine. Now, what people need to realize here is relative to their race paces, those are very slow paces, right? So if you have, a female 5K runner who runs 15 minutes for 5,000 meters, right? That's 4:48 per mile pace, right?
Yep.
That's a race pace. So if you're running at 7:45, that's 3 minutes slower relative to 4:48, right? So it's a large chunk relative to the actual race pace. Now, if you take an adult or high school runner who runs 19 minutes for 5K, right? So that's what 6 minute pace around there, around 6 minute per mile pace, roughly. I would guess. I'm not too sure. I guess I could do the quick calculation, but you're looking at nearly over 2 minutes slower per mile is the race pace. Yet what you'll see is a lot of slow runners will still do their easy runs at like 7:30 to 8:30 pace. So they're only a minute and a half, slower than their race pace. So basically, as a percentage of their race pace, those easy run paces are much more intense for a non-elite runner. And so when we say easy, it's always relative to what a max pace is. So again, a 4:48, versus 7:45 compared to a 6 minute versus 7:45, the 6 minute per mile 5K runner is operating at a much higher race intensity than the elite runner. So I think it's and sometimes pace is not a great indicator because even that pace will be easy for all of these athletes from let's say a percent of heart rate or percent of VO2 max or in terms of metabolic percentage. But yet it's still closer to their race pace. So it's tough to recommend a pace. And some people say run 2 minutes slower than your 5K race pace. In high school runners, that's a pretty common thing I've heard is take 2 minutes off of your race pace. That should be your easy run pace. And I think it's a good starting point. You asked about the mechanical forces as well with that. And I think that, again, that really depends on the runner. Some runners, again, at a slower pace, they don't experience forces that are that different compared to their race pace, which sounds crazy, but it's true. I've seen this in runners, and the individuality of their response to speed is important. So it's definitely something that coaches and athletes need to think about. Now, depending on your philosophy on training, some people don't like to run slow. Some people say, I run fast all the time. And although that might work for some, over the course of the last 20 years, I have to say I've seen way more disasters with that approach than I have with the run easy on your recovery days. It's much more common for people that constantly run fast relatively to either burn out of the sport or get injured and not improve. There's no doubt about that. Even though the science might not be there, I think no one's really studied it because it's such a common sense concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so you were getting at kind of what I was asking as well there, that the relatively speaking slower runners tend to, even when they run easy, let's say metabolically, heart rate, RPE, VO2, they are at a higher percentage of their race pace than the elite runner. And then my follow-up question would then be, do you think that is that correct? I mean, correct is maybe a stronger word, but do you think that is okay? Or do you think that, no, they should be at the same percentage as the elite runners from their race pace when doing their easy runs?
Yeah, I mean, I especially in younger athletes where their bodies are still developing, I think focusing on the mechanical aspect of training is probably more important. young athletes, heart rates, they recover so fast. It's not as big of an issue. I think the bigger issue that will send their running career into a spiral are high risk injuries like bone stress injuries and things like that. So I think if to summarize it all, a junior coach should really focus on the mechanical aspect of training more so than the metabolic aspect of training, especially in those who are at a higher risk of skeletal injuries. And so, yes, in that case, if they're running at a much higher percentage of their race pace, then the mechanical loads on their body will be higher, relatively speaking, than an elite runner. Now that's a very general statement, because again, some runners at slower paces, aren't very mechanically efficient. They still experience quite a bit of force, and vice versa. But in general, on average, I think that a higher percent of race pace will mean a higher mechanical loading for a given person.
Got it. Yeah. And one question that I didn't even put in the questions that I sent to you, but let's see if it's okay anyway to go with this one.
Yeah.
I just thought of it. What about running up hill compared to running on flat ground? How does that impact things biomechanically?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So again, assuming that the paces are similar, right? So if you're doing, let's say, strides or accelerations on a flat ground, and then you do that on an uphill, the vertical force that your body experiences will be less while you're running uphill. Now the metabolic demands will be higher, right? So it's harder to run uphill, obviously. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, so on and so forth. But you're experiencing lower peak vertical forces, and its loading rate, how quickly the force is applied to the body. So on the surface, this sounds good because you're thinking, well, there's less force, of course, so that's good. Now, I agree with that. It's good in the sense that, like, you can find a nice, a small steep or a not so steep hill and do some nice work with intervals up a hill. And it's a good opportunity to work on biomechanics and form and technique. I think that's something that people don't use enough, is use the opportunity of running uphill as a time to cue technique and work on form. It is easier to focus because the foot hits the ground a bit earlier than if you were to run on flat or downhill surfaces. So there's that. The other thing is, when you run uphill, though, you really increase the demands on plantar flexors, or your calves, essentially, right? So, and Achilles tendon. So you've got to be careful with that. And even though the forces are lower, so there's been some nice work on the contributions of muscle force and bone compressive force, as I mentioned earlier. So when you run uphill, of course, you're using your calves more. So the tension forces that the muscles are generating, they are going to contribute to compressing the tibia while you run uphill. So even though the forces are less from the ground onto your body, the forces on the tibia might actually be higher. Now, that also depends on the person and how they run and whatnot, but that's also something to contribute. My point is, I've heard people say, let's do some slight uphill running in people recovering from tibial stress fractures, which is probably a good thing. But there's also the possibility that depending on how fast you're running up that hill, it might actually increase the amount of force applied to the tibia, which might not be good in terms of rehabbing from a bone stress injury on that bone.
Yeah. And what about muscle injuries, like, for example, hamstring strains? Is there a reduced risk of that when running up? Let's say you're doing a workout, an interval workout, 8 times 2 minutes at the same perceived effort uphill versus on the track. Would you have a reduced risk of hamstring injuries running uphill?
Well, so it depends. So that's a tough one because it depends on. So if it's like a high hamstring tendinopathy, or if it's like a muscle injury or distal injury, the issue with running uphill is that you go into sort of more hip flexion. And when you go into more hip flexion, you're essentially lengthening the hamstrings at the hip. And so you might be putting a little more strain on the proximal hamstring tendon, so the tendon that goes from the hamstring attached to the ischial tuberosity on the pelvis, so proximal, closer to your hip joint. So from that perspective, running uphill might be a bit more risky, especially in those with proximal tendinopathy history. I don't know though, in terms of, because again, if it's done effectively, in the sense of progressing, amount of exposure to uphill running, I don't know that there's a higher injury risk necessarily, because you want to load those tissues to make them stronger and over time, and it becomes protective. I will say though, again, this is more speculative based on running mechanics, but if you're introducing uphill running to certain people, I would certainly encourage or cue them not to use long steps. A lot of people go uphill and they try to really increase their step length and run faster. I would say keep the running, keep your running steps tight, and compact, to avoid these large hip flexions early on in a season when you're trying to, basically progress an athlete to increase their resiliency potentially with hill repeats. So you just got to be careful with time of season and how you cue athletes to work on those hills. But you can progress. That's the beauty about biomechanics. You can take an athlete and have them run a slight uphill and focus on short steps, high cadence, and maybe you cue arm motion or posture or something. I'm not saying these are that important. I'm just saying, cue something for the athlete to focus on and keep the stride tight. And as they get stronger, you can kind of lengthen a bit. And as you lengthen the step, you're increasing likely the demands on those proximal hamstring tissues, tendon, and muscle. And so that might be a nice way to progress load, is altering mechanics on the uphill, as opposed to going to a steeper hill, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
You can change the demands of a hill by changing the mechanics of or cueing different mechanics a little bit and giving instructions about how they run it.
Yeah, no, that's all great advice. And so it sounds to me like using hills in, for example, interval work is something similar to trails, something that you can, like, doing many different things can be good as in terms of the whole holistic picture of running, but it's not necessarily, because I have heard some people use hills exclusively for intervals rather than the track to reduce injury risk, but it doesn't sound very clear cut from what you're saying in that sense.
Yeah, it's never clear cut.
Yeah, got it. And a few other topics that I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on is, first of all, aging runners and what happens to injury risk and also recovery time biomechanically when as we age.
Yeah, well, recovery time, I think anyone who's aging, which is everyone obviously, but anyone who's, gotten to a point in their lives where maybe they're not training as much as they used to and they're getting a bit older, everybody knows that it takes a little more time to recover. That's a given. Now, I will say that, and I've heard a lot of these statements over the years, like, once you get beyond 30 or 40 and, you recover more slowly, which is partly true. At the same time, outside of elite athletes, most of us who age, we tend to do less as we age. So sometimes aging is blamed for being the reason why we recover slow. But at the same time, we're also doing less. And so it's not necessarily aging, but it's maybe, decrease in training exposure and increased inactivity that's really contributing to these things. And there's some really, really good research on this from Stephen Harridge and Norman Lazarus on sort of these concepts of how aging is not necessarily as big a culprit as we think, but it's mostly, our increased inactivity over the years that really is speeding up these age-related declines that we observe or that we perceive, right? So anyway, slower recovery potentially, especially if your training exposures go down with age, that they're pretty well intermixed. In terms of injury risk, so Rich Willey and I have written a paper a few years ago on the aging runner specifically, and so we focus on sort of injury risks and what to do, biomechanical differences between those who get injured or between aging and younger runners. And then, we talk about physiological factors, training and whatnot. But I would say that typically aging runners are at a higher risk of sort of lower leg injuries. So, basically shin down, a bit of knee, but mostly Achilles tendon and calf injuries. Those are pretty common or more common in older or aging runners. And that part of that is because as we age, especially if we stop doing higher intensity work, so maybe we do less jumping or less sprinting, or any movement that require quite a bit of plantar flexor or calf involvement. Because those muscles are fairly small, as we age, we seemingly lose a bit more function in those muscles because they are smaller. And so basically the use it or lose it concept, obviously you don't lose them, but you definitely lose some of them. And so I think it's really important to maintain the function of our calves and plantar flexors with age. So a lot of, small jumps and hops and a bit faster running, some uphill running, of course. And the biggest sort of warning I want to give people though is, as you listen to this podcast, maybe you haven't run, or maybe you haven't done hills in 4 years or something, or you haven't done plyometrics in 4 years. And then you decide, I'll do plyometrics tomorrow and then hills the next day. Well, obviously now it's a new stimulus to you relative to what you've been doing. So anytime you add something to target a specific muscle group, make sure you do it very progressively and don't be impatient, really take your time. And patience is obviously the name of the game here. You gotta be very, very patient with how you progress loads at any given area of the body.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. And what about sex differences between males and females? Are there any that are worth pointing out?
Yeah, although there's been a good amount of research on gender differences between men and women, obviously, in terms of biomechanics, it's very broad. So we don't necessarily know a lot, about younger runners or middle-aged runners or young adults or older runners. So there's a bit more research coming out on this, but it's still kind of a broad topic at the moment. Obviously, more research is being done on female athletes, which will really help fill the void and the gaps in that in the literature. But there definitely are some gender differences in terms of biomechanical factors. Often we might see more motion at the hip joint in women, especially sort of frontal and transverse plane. So hip adduction, or when the hip kind of comes in towards the other leg, and then internal rotation when the femur rotates inwards while running. And then a bit also the position of the knee in the frontal plane. So often we see more knee valgus or knee abduction in female runners, and potentially a little more drop of the pelvis when we run. So contralateral pelvic drop. But that's not consistent across the board, of course. Again, because there haven't been really that many studies on elite distance runners. Like, let's say men and women elite distance runners, are they that much different? Probably not as much as, novice male and female runners. It also depends on what's their history. So, for example, if you compare women who used to play soccer or volleyball or another fairly high intensity sport versus men who are sedentary, and you have them run, I would expect that the differences might be in favor, in quotation marks, towards the female athletes, because they're just generally more athletic. So, as you can see, it gets confusing because we don't quite know, that things haven't been controlled very well, when we compare these gender differences. And so it's really hard to tell. But there are, as I said, a couple of variables that seem to be different between men and women, and those might contribute to injury risks, especially patellofemoral pain syndrome, which, often motions at the hip tend to or seem to be risk factors for those anterior knee pain or patellofemoral pain syndrome, which are more prevalent in female runners.
Mm. And are there any implications of those findings that we do have in terms of advice for what could be done to prevent patellofemoral pain, for example?
Well, as you know, I think I think the cueing, so cueing on form is one thing that people have tried. Not the outcomes haven't been too great in terms of the science that has come of it. Of course, strength training. But if you see it, most physios you see, they'll try to strengthen your glutes, right? It's the idea that's like the cure for all injuries. It seems. There was a funny tweet a little while, probably a couple of years ago, but Alice Wright, who's a elite English marathoner, distance runner, she mentioned it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing where she said, calf injuries, glute strength, or something like that. Knee injuries, glute strengthening, and then she goes, migraines, glute strengthening. So it was kind of like this all-encompassing. If you have any problems with your body, just do glute strengthening and it should fix it. As a bit of a joke to the fact that everyone says strengthen your glutes, but there's actually not really any evidence that making your glutes stronger will alter your biomechanics. And so someone, the summary on the research is basically if you train your glutes to be stronger, you will become better at doing glute exercises, right? But it doesn't translate to changing your mechanics.
Yeah. But does it have to be a change in mechanics that helps injury prevention, or could it just be that strengthening, I don't know, alters the response to the loading on the muscle and the tendons and the bones? Right.
So the theory here is that maybe by strengthening glutes, you don't change the mechanics, but potentially the tissue is more, in quotations, resilient, right? And so it can handle more load. We don't know. We really don't know. I used to be really sort of a strong belief in that concept. And, I've had some good conversations with colleagues, whether it was in person or email or, on Twitter. And I think it's simple to see that it's not clear cut, that we don't really know. And so I want to keep an open mind there. It might also be other factors that improving strength and reducing injury risks might be as simple as, maybe you're a bit more athletic. Maybe you become more athletic by doing these things. Maybe you're changing your positions, not necessarily joint positions, but how you step and things. And so it's blurry a little bit. The mechanisms aren't clear. If increasing strength of the gluteal muscles reduces injury risk, which it doesn't seem to do that, the mechanism for that is not clear.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier the rotating of shoes as a good thing to do. Just a question on when to replace shoes and how long to run in them. Is there any research on this, or if not, or do you have any anecdotal evidence or practical advice?
There's been some work on trying to quantify changes in the biomechanics of running in shoes that are new or after X amount of miles or whatever. And I think people say after some 300 miles or 400 miles you change your shoes, but this goes back to the whole topic that we started with, which is quantifying training load, right? If you only use mileage as your assessment of how good your shoes are now or how damaged your shoes are, it doesn't account for how many steps do you take per mile, right? Because if you're super tall and very light, you're taking longer steps, so less steps per mile, arguably. Let's assume everyone is the same pace, right? So longer steps, fewer steps per mile. If you're lighter, then less mechanical load is being placed on the materials of the shoe, because obviously a shoe is not biological. It's a material that is synthetic, and so it doesn't regenerate, right? There's no blood supply. It just kind of dies and dies and dies over time. But so, if you're lighter, you take longer steps, potentially, per mile, because you're taking fewer steps per mile, you end up applying less stress on, or less force on the shoe. And so those shoes might last a lot longer. Some shoes have material that doesn't last that long. And so I hate the idea of number of miles. I have shoes back here on our back porch that I've had for probably 10 years. And, and sometimes I have a gazillion pairs of shoes, and I have brand new ones and older ones. And, I'll run in older shoes at times. I think, I'm not saying I've run every day in those over 10 years, of course. I might have run 12 times a year in those shoes because I've got so many pairs. But, I think for me personally, it was always a question of feel. Like I could feel when it was time to retire a pair of shoes, and it wasn't, I never quantified how much mileage I put on shoes or how many steps I took on shoes or how many minutes I ran on those shoes. It was always like, okay, I know these have maybe 1 or 2 runs left in them and I'm going to throw them out,
Yeah.
And it's hard to describe, but it goes back to feel and education and experience with running. As the more you know about yourself and how certain things feel, the better you are at making decisions overall. But that's an example of that.
Yeah. No, I do agree with you. I'm the same in that by conventional wisdom, I'm probably using my shoes for too many miles, quote unquote. But I do feel when they start to degrade.
Yeah.
And then I guess my mistake is sometimes I still take another 100 kilometers before actually replacing them. But that's a different story.
Yeah.
But
the evidence on use there, the evidence on use of shoes and injuries isn't great either. So there's no real evidence saying like when shoes are this old, you're more likely to get injured.
Yeah.
Now, you might feel better in them, but it doesn't mean you're going to get injured or not get injured. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the shoes topic, and then just a couple of other questions before we get into the rapid fire ones.
Yeah, sure.
The first one is, what are some common mistakes you want to point out for runners to avoid? And this can be anything, not just biomechanics or the topics we discussed, but anything related to running.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of things I think here, common mistakes. We've alluded to the whole easy run thing. I really believe that. I tend to be again. This is going to be more of a focus on younger runners, youth runners. I like for them to do a little less volume, so they might not run. They might only run like 25 to 35 minutes on easy runs. But I really like to like them to keep it very relatively slow, and so the reason why I use minutes there is because, again, I have a wide range of athletes. So if I tell them to go run 4 miles, some of them are running 7:30 per mile, others are running 9 minutes per mile, and so a 9 minute per mile for 4 miles, of course, is going to take 36 minutes versus a 7 minute per mile is 28 minutes. So that, you're looking at a 8 minute difference, on one day of the week. So I like to just minutes, keep it easy on easy days. The other thing is runners try to do too much at once. You finish a season and then you take some time off maybe, and then you listen to a podcast or you hear, you read an Instagram, post by some pro athlete, and they're doing these strength exercises, and the podcast says you should do some plyometrics and hill running and all this stuff. And then they come back and they try to incorporate everything at once. Strength training, plyometrics, hill running, running, and it's just too much, right? So I would say one of those mistakes is, incorporate things, compartmentalize it. Start with strength training maybe, and then add some hill running, and then add some plyometrics later on, and so on and so forth. So really being careful with that. And then the last thing I would say is, is often, and this is more for coaches, is assuming that athletes are responding the way you think they're responding to your training. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes I see in coaches is, they don't really communicate or observe as well as they should, and they sort of miss on some opportunities to maybe back off of training or increase training or whatnot. So those are probably the main 3 things I would say.
Yeah, no, all great points, are really good. And what is one thing that you're currently learning about or studying or are fascinated by, and why?
Oh, everything, Michael. Everything to do with running, fascinated by. We've got some, a wide array of studies. Some studies about, trying to learn about coaches' beliefs and strategies in injury risk reduction. Like, what do coaches think are important factors, and how do we reduce injury risks? And it'll be interesting to compare that with what we know in the literature. Doing some work on one of my students right now is finishing up a thesis project on strength training in middle-aged runners. So we're trying to look at different types of strength training over a 10-week period to see how it changes, economy and then plantar flexor function and Achilles tendon stiffness over the course of 10 weeks in middle-aged runners. A lot of footwear work, footwear in less and more experienced runners. And by experience, I mean lifetime exposure to running. And then, so seeing if those, when you present a novel footwear condition to a low or high experienced runner, do they respond differently to that? And so the hypothesis is that if you're less experienced, you're likely to be, your mechanics are likely to be more malleable. You might respond more to a footwear condition, whereas if you're experienced, you're so used to running a certain way that the footwear might not influence your mechanics as much if you're highly experienced. Learning a lot about at the moment, learning a lot more about sort of the psychology of injury and behavior changes. I think that's a part of my career that I haven't really focused on and known much about. Of course, from experience you learn things, but really from a scientific standpoint, so I focus on that a bit more. And some interesting studies coming up in the next few months and years that are in the works, and so some large studies and smaller ones and whatnot.
Great. Yeah. And we'll link to your profiles on Twitter and so on in the show notes, so people can follow you and see what you get published in the next little while.
Sounds good.
Now let's move on to the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to running or science?
I gotta be nerdy here. I gotta go with Alex Hutchinson's Endure. I think that's just that brilliant book.
Yeah, that's the most voted answer to this question in 300 plus episodes.
It's amazing. I mean, it's just so good. Yeah.
Yeah. What's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Whoa, that's a tough question. Patience.
That's a good answer.
Patience.
And who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So many people, but probably most of my coaches. My high school coach, François Bellil from Canada, he's on Twitter as well, and then I would say so that would be sort of personally professional, but also Trent Stellingwerff, who really close friend and mentor of mine.
Awesome. And finally, just for listeners that want to check you out directly, what is your Twitter handle, any other social media website, and anywhere that we can find you?
Yeah, so I mean, Twitter is probably the platform that I'm most active on. I just think it's very useful to interact with people, and good and bad at times. But my Twitter handle is very unoriginal. It's simply Biomech So Biomech and then Max. So that's me on Twitter. I'd like to share some stuff on there. So
perfect. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Max. It's been really great to have you on and learn a lot of stuff about biomechanics, training load, and so on. I really appreciated it, and looking forward to talking to you another time.
Of course, Michael. Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with links to Max's Twitter and ResearchGate and other profiles. One episode that I think that you might be interested in if you enjoyed this one is the one that I did with Izzy Moore back in episode 241. So I'll link to that as well in the show notes. We might have even talked about that or her research in the interview with Max, but I can't remember at the moment of recording this outro. I also mentioned Max's interview on the Physical Performance Show, which I will link to as well, and some of the papers that are relevant for the discussion that we had. So plenty of links there that you can check out. And while you're on the website, if you're interested in taking your triathlon to the next level, check out the information about our coaching services and our training plans. Those are two great ways to help you take you one step closer to achieving your triathlon goals. And we have plenty of other people that have gone through the same process, and you can actually find a lot of reviews on the website from people like you that have been coached by us or are coached by us or have used the training plan, so you can find out what others in your situation have thought about it. So check that out as well. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out directly if you want more information. Next Monday on the podcast, we have Dr. Dustin Joubert, who will talk us through his so-called super shoe study, where he compared almost all of the carbon-plated shoes out on the market at that moment in time to see which ones performed the best. And I won't spill the beans on that if you don't know already. But tune in on Monday and you will find out. And you'll find out all the details about it as well. It's a really interesting one. And definitely do not go and buy any pair of super shoes between now and that interview. It's worth waiting a bit and listening to what Dustin has to say. And that will help you make an informed decision on where you spend your money when it comes to super shoes. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free online sweat test and quick carb calculator to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs and individualize your plan. Also, book a free video consultation with the team to refine that strategy. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products. And thank you to Zenite. Use the Zenite swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and most importantly, your swim training consistency. Get 20% off your order on the swim trainer with a promo code that you can get on zeniteswimtrainer.com/TTS. And don't forget that it's a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks, send it back and you'll get a full refund. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.